This is Justice Worriers, a podcast where we think about things that are right and wrong in our world and how Christian ideas can help us respond to them. We prefer hard questions over easy answers, and we'd love you to join us in our ramblings. Listen in and contact us using the links in the show notes. Hello, welcome to Justice Worriers, spelled with an O, episode 4. My name's Andy and I'm joined by Leah. Say hi, Leah.
Hi there.
And Jörg. Say hi, Jörg.
Hello.
And we're all stuck at home, keeping out of other people's way because of the coronavirus. And this set us to thinking about what on earth God is doing when bad things happen and what justice looks like and stuff like that. I don't want to preempt too much. I can see Jörg making facial expressions already.
It's just twitches.
So we thought we'd talk about some of the things that are just at the top of our mind when we're in a position that is scary and inconvenient for us, and many people are in positions that are tragic and very difficult. So that's what our podcast today is about. But at this point in the podcast, we would normally talk about the homework that we've done, that we've set ourselves to help us think through this topic. So what homework have you done, everyone?
I think life is currently feeling a bit stressful for homework, so I've opted out.
I've been working from home, so
That counts.
Yeah, my homework has just been to work at home and not kill my children and get something productive done. I think that's been it.
I find it so hard to make myself do anything at all when I'm working from home. That, I don't know why that is, but that is the way my brain seems to work. So you're lucky that I'm even out of bed, is what I'm saying.
Welcome to the life of an academic.
Spoken as if you are actually still in bed.
Yeah.
So we've started developing a little bit of an agenda or a plan for our episodes. So the way we want to talk through things is to start off by talking about a topic we've called "What are your worries?" or essentially, what is it about this topic or this situation that troubles you, or just is the key question for you. So we're really talking about, we're talking about stuff that's inspired by coronavirus today. So does anyone have a volunteer of what worries them in particular about this?
Well, the toilet paper shortage is the first one, of course, because that is a problem for which there's no other solution. But other than that, I guess personally, I don't have too many worries. For me, it feels like I'm just on one of those normal terms where I work from home. I have to share my office with wife and sometimes children, but that is doable. What I find a lot more worrying on a practical level is what will happen when it gets to countries where, first of all, there's a lot more informal employment, and secondly, who do not have the ability to throw pots and pots of cash at the problem with borrowing. So, for example, in Nigeria, they closed the markets in Lagos as of today. Now, that's not only a problem for shopping, but for, the 70% of informally employed who rely on the markets and little jobs or little things they can get away with to even eat that day. I was scheduled to go to Ethiopia just before, so a lot of travel restrictions came in. I stepped away from it the last minute. It's a similar worry for the country there, with a beginning civil war on western side as well, where you feel like some of these restrictions being put in the country could also be used by governments to do all sorts of things. Or think about the India lockdown today as well, and think what Modi can do with that. So there's some real practical worries when it gets out of the circuit of countries that can actually do a lot about it. And the hope is that the very early measures that most African countries have taken, for example, India's taken, will be enough to keep the curve flat. But we don't know.
And what about you, Leah? Does this all lead you to question God's character, or are you comfortable with that? Or?
I think you pretty much said it in the first sentence, didn't you? That, well, what's God doing here? Is God doing anything here? Is kind of the next question to that, isn't it? And where do we interpret these events in the light of our faith? That's totally perplexing to me, to be honest. We could very straightforwardly look at it from just a justice perspective, as Jörg has outlined, that it seems horribly unjust that the vulnerable people in our societies and the vulnerable people in countries that are just generally more insecure are going to be the ones that suffer. And it does beg that where's God in the suffering, or question straight away to my mind.
Yeah, and we mentioned in our discussion beforehand, I think Jörg mentioned that this is a very unchristian illness that picks off the weakest in society.
The weakest, the oldest, and we talk about it that way too, right? It's like, oh, person had a pre-existing condition.
Yeah.
All right, yeah, it's not going to be me. And you think it's almost amplifying that, like there's a weaker element that deserves to die as long as it's not the strong children. And then you get the stories about, I don't know, the 21-year-old or 19-year-old or whoever was in the paper today who died.
Yeah.
And that is then front page news because that's not how it's supposed to happen. You think, wait, what's happening with the conversation here?
Yeah, the valuing of people's lives, yeah. Yeah, it's almost done in a way like, when the death of someone in the armed forces is announced on the radio, and they always make very sure to say their family's been informed, so that no one's at home thinking, is that my relative? And it feels like they're doing the same thing there. It's like, oh, don't worry, it was only one of them that died. You don't have to worry. And yeah, it's ugly when put that way.
Yeah.
And I think it goes away to explain some of the behaviour that we saw at the weekend when people were kind of using lockdown as a reason to go and enjoy the coast or North Wales or wherever, because people thought, well, I'm fit and healthy and it's not going to affect me directly. I'll make the best use of this time, which...
And then there's that is kind of connected to a larger sort of theological worry here as well, is that there is an evaluation of lives going on. I mean, one of the things I've been struggling with is whether the measures we're taking are adequate, because so often when we have a flu epidemic, we know it's going to cost, 250,000 people's lives around the globe, older people, usually. And so far we've been looking at a death rate of today, I think 20,000. And yet the measures are so much more drastic that we've put in place. I'm not saying that these aren't right. This is a new illness. We don't quite know yet what the death rate is. It's nowhere near Ebola, certainly. It's also nowhere near MERS. But what I'm getting to is that if you're in a position of power now, you have to weigh the economy against people.
Yeah.
And you have to kind of make a decision that I don't think we're made to do. Like there's when death seems normal, we're ready to accept it. When it's abnormal, we're not, and yet we're still going to get hit very hard. And pretty soon we're going to hear people saying, well, we should have stuck it out. We should have just said, instead of a huge global recession, we don't even know the depth of that yet. We should have just accepted some deaths, boosted hospitals, do what we can, and the rest is nature taking its toll. So it's almost like we're forced to be making choices that we are not meant to be making. Like, does that make sense?
So what you're saying, they're choices that we'd normally think of as God's choices to make? I mean,
yeah,
there's a lot of...
that have a moral dilemma either way. Like, okay, yes, of course you always err on the side of people, but then we still make choices toward letting people die versus the greater macroeconomic good, because we don't shut down the world for a flu epidemic. Like, not even swine flu in 2009, which was huge. And here we're doing it. And again, I'm not saying one is right or wrong, but we're now constantly pitching these two things against one another. If you look at how different countries are reacting, I mean, Trump is a problem in many different ways, but what he's been saying about, like, how deep can we let this go for the economy is a really, really clearly presents the choice that a lot of people are in front of now. That is a deeply, deeply immoral choice.
Is this the closest you've ever come to agreeing with Trump, Jörg?
Yeah, no. But I mean, even Johnson, like, they went one way first and then the other way. And I guess all I'm trying to say is that it's important to take seriously how difficult that choice is, because it actually requires you to make choices about the future that you cannot fully foresee. You don't know how many people are going to die. You don't know how many people are going to be hit by the economic crisis. And it's wrong to play one out against the other anyway, ethically wrong. And yet you're forced to do it by the situation.
Yeah, and I think it's important to make the point that in a lot of situations, the economy also means people's lives, right? And this false division between it's either money or people seems completely naive, especially in a country where the whole economy is based around the marketplace and people don't have enough money to last a couple of weeks without trading.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Then saying, "Oh, it's just money against people," is completely naive.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But actually, it's a choice it's a choice that we make all the time in the environmental debate, isn't it? We're constantly prioritizing the economy over the environment, and all the talk that there is about whether GDP is a good measure of growth and a good measure of how well society's doing is exactly the same question, isn't it? Are we measuring well-being, or are we measuring the economy? And maybe if we'd developed a better way of measuring the well-being and flourishing of society, then that might have given us a tool to sit in between those two extremes. But we've always looked at the economy in terms of raw numbers, and that kind of hides the fact that it is people's livelihoods and is people's well-being, but it also hides the fact that well-being is so much more than just money.
But you could even drive this point about choices further. I mean, this is sort of a macroeconomic game that not game, but like decision-making process that most of us are not part of, or any of us really. But people in hospital have to decide who to give the ventilator to. The Deliveroo driver has to decide when he or she's having just a slight cough, whether they should self-isolate or if it's the cold from last week. Because it's between feeding and not getting a sick note, or protecting others when you can't be entirely sure what it is. Healthcare workers who have children, and maybe single mother who's working in the healthcare sector, has to make a choice to go to work and whose life to prioritize. So these kind of situations force us to make such difficult and deeply, deeply immoral choices.
Why are they immoral, though? I mean, they're the sort of choices that human beings had to make all the time in the past that we've been insulated from, by and large, in Western society for a long while, aren't they?
Well, they're moral because you have to decide against a life. You decide, you end up weighing one life against another. Like, they're not, you're right. We are always making these kinds of choices, but they don't quite agree with what we will then typically pronounce as an ethical principle. You always choose life. And then when you're in a situation like this, it's very difficult. Whose life, all of a sudden, is the question.
Yeah, but I think what I'm saying is that those choices are only unusual to us in the Western world in this particular century. They're choices that people have had to make for thousands of years and still do in many parts of the world on a daily basis, aren't they?
Those that died by wearing the badge, they're the chosen whites. Those who died are justified for wearing the badge, they're the chosen whites. The justified. Those that died, they're the chosen whites.
Yeah, I think Jesus' behaviour is a really helpful place to go immediately on that. Yeah, if you look at how he related to people who'd been thrown away by the rest of society, which is the kind of thing we're talking about, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
People who are considered useless or worse than rubbish. And he treated them with total value and cared about their state of mind and their state of health.
But yet, he goes into the pool of Bethesda and heals one person. He doesn't take care of everybody around him. So there is an element of that kind of a choice going on as well.
Yeah, and how does that relate to the randomness of that? How does that relate to the randomness of the threat of the virus?
I mean, for me, the big thing about these choices, or why I feel they're moral, is that they don't square with what we are learning or what we believe the good to be, which is to value our neighbors, to value life, to choose life wherever we can. And yet we find ourselves thrown into situations where we know what good is, and none of the paths we can take leads us there. So in some ways, I started to think about the tree of knowledge, good and evil, and how really this is a good description of the human condition, is that we know what's good, we know what's evil, we may or may not, we often don't have the power to follow through on it and to bring what's good. So we're left with this sort of understanding of what's happening right now is a very difficult wave, a pandemic, an illness that is behaving wrongly, that's not doing good. And yet there's only so little we can do to stop it. We can try and lock down the country. It will have some effect, but it won't have an effect for a number of people. We will still have to make choices, again, about who to give the ventilator to, what life to prioritize, about the West versus the rest, how much money is actually then going to go to the South when it hits there. So it's very much it brings us back to this, life throws things at us that have no simple solution. And yet our idealism, our innate idealism, our wishes, our feeling about the world will be in sharp contrast to that. And that to me is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
And those innate feelings are not wrong. Those feelings and those ways of looking at the world come from the Bible, don't they? They are the justice that we've been talking about. So
Absolutely,
as you say,
yeah.
we end up with this horrible tension between a God that seems to say that all life is sacred and the individual matters and he cares deeply for each one of us, and yet on the other hand seems to allow life to be treated very cheaply.
Yeah, that's exactly the tension, and the the alternative to that, the tree of life, is just to trust God and to I don't know, take things as they come. I don't know what it would have been like to just live off the tree of life, but it doesn't seem like it's a very straightforward answer for us now. We know what's good, what's bad, but the world is so much more complicated than our ethical systems, and it will come with these really, really difficult choices. And at the same time, and this is the same thing in the Bible, okay, yes, we are in this fallen condition, and yet the Bible keeps telling us, but you know what's good, and you should do what's good. Like, this ethical imperative is never withdrawn from us, and yet if we're really honest, we are thrown into choices every day where we are forced to make the wrong decision. And it becomes much more clearer during an epidemic like this, when it's just us paying taxes and going about our business and not worrying about the inequalities of the world, and then, maybe being shocked about migrants who drowned in the Mediterranean. But I can't do anything about this anyway. I know I'm profiting from the system. So again, we're living in a world where it's a lot more complicated, where I'm told what I'm supposed to do, and yet it's so hard to do it. So
I think what you're saying is that for you, the COVID-19 thing brings into sharp relief a situation that's going on all the time anyway. So all the time, our actions are in our actions, we are always making these choices about justice and trying to preserve life and do the right thing, but yet generally they're actions about what kind of bananas we buy in the supermarket, as opposed to whether we give somebody a ventilator or not. So
and the bananas I buy in the supermarket don't really do that much. The world is a lot more complicated than our little ethical choices. So if you go through the laundry list of our feel-good things we do, they contribute so little. And if I go to Ethiopia and I give a lot of money to one person, it still doesn't make a huge difference. And actually, there could be a lot of trouble coming from that. So, like, we're so used to boiling down the ethical imperatives to simple choices. But yet, if we open our eyes, the world is full of the kinds of choices we're now facing with COVID-19 that are complex, that are not easy to make, that make me feel like I shouldn't be allowed to make those kind of choices.
So what is God up to, and how do I go through most of my life without that visceral sense?
Yeah.
I've noticed that I've been genuinely afraid for my life and afraid for the life of people that I love over the last couple of weeks in a way that I just normally am not, and that's incredibly naive of me. Because people die all the time. But yeah, it brings it home, doesn't it?
Well, and we need to talk about death, because death is at the center of our faith and the hope that comes through death. I mean, that's a whole nother step to discuss about a Christian sense of justice, because we believe that justice comes through Jesus' death. And in a way or another, we are actually also asked to emulate that death of Jesus, by picking up our own crosses. But maybe we have to get to that a bit later. But for the first thing I would say is that it really just brings into sharp focus the fallen state of the world that we live in. And we sometimes have the sense, if only we did the right things, if only everybody could agree, and we did this and this and this and this, we would bring the world to a better place. And I'm not so sure about that. And, you have, even in a crisis like this, you have all these people, like, if you did that, you can definitely flatten the curve. And yes, some of this will have an effect, but it's never going to be that simple. There's always going to be, unintended consequences. The Bible's full of these kinds of stories, and I think they're true. There's something about this world that is not yet what we're promised, in a way.
So, if you're not careful, then you will go to the other extreme and go, well, these justice warriors are just worrying unnecessarily. And I don't know, that kind of, as Allah wills it sort of perspective that says, well, God's doing his thing and we'll just get on with our lives because these changes and these decisions don't make much difference.
Yeah. Well, this is exactly where I think actually Islam and Christianity have a lot in common, not in that supposed fatalism, but that they then still come with ethical imperatives, how you should live in your day-to-day existence. Loving your neighbor doesn't end by COVID-19. You're still asked to give sacrificially. You're still asked, but you shouldn't expect that all the good things you do will necessarily make the evil go away or bring the world into a better focus. So this is the tension that we're living in. That on the one hand, we could find ourselves in a world where we think, okay, if, like I said earlier, if we only did all the right things, we would bring the world to this better place, to this kingdom of God state. On the other hand, we don't want to be fatalistic, and we're not allowed to be fatalistic because in our immediate surroundings, we do have power. We do have choices to make. We do sometimes make the wrong choice, and we do sometimes make the right choice. So this is never taken away from us. But we also shouldn't take that to mean that Therefore, if only we all did the right thing, everything would be so much simpler and so much more straightforward. It's not.
And I think part of the problem is that as Christians, we don't really know how to view success properly. We still see success so much in the same way that the world sees success. You know, if you create some kind of charity or some kind of program or do some kind of action that you can then, you implement and then you see some demonstrable good from it, then that's a Christian success. And I'm just not sure that that's the way that Jesus, if you looked at Jesus' life, you wouldn't see a program and a measurable outcome and all the rest of it. And I think we are called to a life of unintended consequences, that we do what we believe to be right in our sacrificial offering to God and living our life in the way that we believe, that we're meant to be living. And then we leave the rest up to Him.
So would it be humble of us to say, okay, we need to take on God's perspective on people dying and just accept it? And what would that look like? Would that be a good thing or a bad thing?
I think that's a false choice. Like, of course we are accepting that people die. We are accepting that we die. But it's never right to have somebody dying right in front of me and saying, well, that seems to be God's choice. So, like, as long as I have room to act, I'm called to do the right thing. But we also live in a fallen world where our actions will not necessarily translate in what we intend.
And I think we're right to question God about death and about all those passages in the Bible where God appears to take the death of vast numbers of people incredibly lightly. Those passages should trouble us and we should wrestle with them. We shouldn't just go, well, there we go. It all came out right in the end and Jesus came. We can't just say that.
Yeah, so we're kind of saying that, I mean, maybe this is obvious to everyone else, but we're kind of saying you shouldn't do what God is doing in this situation. Right? God is letting all these people die. And we have to accept that we can't change everything, but we also have to not sit back and let people die and participate in what our society is doing to try and prevent that.
Yeah, and I think our prayers can be like we were talking earlier about Moses on the top of Sinai when all the Israelites bowed down to the golden calf down at the bottom of the mountain, and his basic argument to God was, if you just destroy them all, that's against your character and that's not who you are, God. I mean, what a curious conversation to have with God, but that's how it went. And I think we can be bold to do that. What's going on with this coronavirus, God? This appears to be a most ungodly illness. If there was such a thing as a godly illness. I've got myself in New York now, but do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and we studied Habakkuk in our home group last night, and he's a prophet, basically God saying to God, why are you letting these awful people do these unjust things, which is maybe a bit like us a few weeks ago. And then God says, don't worry, I'm going to use Babylon to kill them all. And then Habakkuk replies and says, well, that's much worse, because Babylon are even worse than Israel. So why are you doing that? And God says, oh, don't worry, I'll kill all them in the end as well. And Habakkuk then ends with this song about how great God is, how powerful God is, including with this terrifying line about how plague kind of walks. What does it say? Plague. It's a slightly ambiguous, in the version I read, it was a slightly ambiguous line about whether plague is like one of God's foot soldiers or whether it's kind of running away from him because he's so scary. And then, so everything's fine because God's going to kill all of them as well.
But in a way, this is the same answer Job gets, right? Just reversed here. So, like, his glory covered the heavens and his praise filled the earth. This is Habakkuk 3, verses 3 and on. His splendor was like the sunrise, rays flashed from his hands where his power was hidden. Plague went before him, pestilence followed his steps. He stood and shook the earth, he looked and made the nations tremble, the ancient mountains crumble, and the age-old hills collapse. His ways are eternal. This is indeed like Job's answer. Like, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? What do you have to do with any of this? So again, this is going back to this place of there is something larger, something slightly terrible that surrounds us in the world that we're living in. I take this a lot more sort of deeply philosophically, that what biblical authors are acknowledging is that the world is complicated and there is no simple answer to justice. Do right and it'll be good. Yes, you should do right, but this whole, like, if you do this, then this will be your reward is never that simple.
But I take God's answer to... Go on. No, sorry.
And I think the whole way that our society thinks is that if we can just come up with the right scheme and the right plan, and if we can just be disciplined enough to implement it carefully, and if we can, spend the right amount of money on it, then we will sort this out. And I think that's a business person's way of looking at things, and we've translated it over into our faith as well. If we can just, and that's why we love looking at Wilberforce, because we look back and we say, hey, he had a plan, he motivated people, he mobilized the church, he got rid of slavery. He
changed the structure of society. That's what we
it's a big success, and we can all. Yeah, we can all
really, without
that.
the American Revolution, none of that would have happened.
Yeah, I mean,
how do you convince a bunch of slaveholders to let go of slaves unless they can harm the Americans?
Yeah, so I mean, as we know, and we probably now's not the time to talk about it. There were all sorts of other things that played into that change, and Wilberforce was one part of it. And the world is far more complex, but we like to tell that simplistic story of we did this, then we did that, and then hey, look, success. God brought success. But actually that's just a version of man's success in a different context.
And now you do what they tell you, and now you do what they told you. And now.
So when I hear what Jesus is saying, when he's accusing the structures of society, or the people who are upholding the structures that are keeping people oppressed, when I read that, I think in those simple terms we should just invert the power structures.
But then
is that wrong? Was that what he was talking about, or not?
Well, what does Jesus actually do? He takes.
I didn't say what he did. I said what he said.
Yeah. And then when disciples said, let's invert the power structures, get out of them swords, he said, put them away. This is not the time nor the place. Whoever picks up the sword will die by the sword. And then he goes to the cross. And he makes visible all the iniquities. He takes them on himself. He takes on the most unjust death. And that's his way of achieving justice. Like, it's such a twisted story, and I think that's important for our Christian message, that the Christian idea of justice is not to go to that hubris and say, we know what we need to do. Let's just go out there, tumble the powers, and get on with it. There's something very important in Jesus' teaching and sort of calling out for these ethical imperatives, but at the same time, he also recognized that this is something that is greater than just a revolution. There's an element that needs to come from God. There's an element of us finding salvation and doing the right thing. This is bigger than a plan.
That is so difficult. So, like, Leah's thing of, indirect consequences, I can kind of understand, but it feels totally hopeless. But the idea of there's some, if we just kind of in some spiritual thing happens, and then that in some way Yeah, I can't get my head around that. Go on, Leah, you say something more coherent.
I was only going to say it's the mustard seed thing. That's what the mustard seed's about. It's a small, insignificant thing that works its way into the soil and dies, and then produces something wholly unexpected.
And you know why there's so many mustard seeds? Because most of them die uselessly.
Yeah. Great. I'm sure we've cheered everyone up. So
Leah, can you say what a mustard seed is?
So when Jesus is talking about the kingdom of heaven, which is Jesus's way of saying the way of life and the way of things being organised that he's come to bring, he talks about the kingdom of heaven being like a mustard seed. That's a incredibly small seed that, as Jörg says, there's thousands of them and most of them don't do much at all, but they do then grow into, and I don't think it actually is a terribly significant tree. I just think they grow into lots and lots of plants.
It's like an ugly bush that takes ages to grow.
Yeah, it's like a not very attractive thing at all. But, and I just feel that that's the way God works, and we don't see it. It doesn't look exciting. It's not fun quite a lot of the time. And every now and then we get to see some kind of great moment when we go, oh yeah, God was really working there, and I can really see how the thing that he encouraged me to do had this impact. But that's like 5% of the time if you're lucky.
But it's at the same time, it's something that gives you there's an element of freedom and faith in here, because what does Jesus pray when he dies? He says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. God, this is no longer on me. I did what you asked me to do. I made visible the sins of this world. I took it on my body. The rest is going to be in your hands. This is not my project alone. And I wonder if more of that needs to be in our lives as we go around and say, God, I'm going to do what I'm going to do, but my hope is in you. It's not in the system bearing out, because that, again, is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. I know how to fix it. But to say, okay, God, you've told me to do this. You've called me to this kind of life. You called me to make the right ethical choices. And now I'm before this conundrum. I'm just going to do what I think you require of me, and the rest I'm going to leave to you. And I think so. I think there's something very profound.
And it's tremendously liberating as well. I think.
Yeah.
I sometimes think if I hadn't been a Christian, would I still have been interested in all the social justice issues that I'm interested in? And yeah, I think by now I'd probably be some burnt out Oxfam worker somewhere. That because if you care about these things, you carry them, and you carry them like big weights on your shoulders. But that's not what we're called to do. And as we can somehow get our head around some of what you just said, really, Jörg, then it is actually a liberation.
And
I was listening to that, just feeling like that I just wished I had any of that at all.
But I mean, that's the choice we make when we become Christians, is that we believe not just in the death of Jesus, but in the resurrection, in the most outlandish story of all, that there is something coming from God that will vindicate that choice, and that has vindicated that choice. And I think that is such a profound part of the story, that this is what kicks off the church. They don't go away from the tomb and say, we've got to do something about this. These ethical pronouncements of Jesus are so great. Can we at least write them down and talk to many people about them, and then we'll build something? No, there's something that came toward them. That's the story. There's something that woke them up that they didn't expect, that was so great to comprehend. They didn't even see it when it happened in front of their eyes. And when their eyes were opened, it blew them away. And is that sense of, God, I'm going to commit this into your hands, and I will trust the story that there is something coming from you, that is at the heart of Jesus' idea of justice and our justification indeed. If we don't believe that, then why are we in it? If we don't believe that God will turn toward us in the end and say, good, well done.
And I think, as those issues we were talking about earlier about the sanctity of life and kind of the apparent ease with which lives are lost, that's also about the resurrection, isn't it? That if we look at those questions from the perspective of the resurrection, they don't go away, but they look different.
Mm. Well, and they should be, like you said earlier, like this kind of cynical, well, yeah, we could be resurrected, but they're like the same kind of thing should happen here, that there's a genuine sadness about the life lost. And then offering it up to God, like you do in your prayers, Andy, often kind of saying, we don't know, this is yours, God, we don't understand. And freeing it up in that sense and saying, God, you come toward us. We don't want to give up on that hope that there is a future coming toward us that comes from you, that we are not building.
Yeah, there's no choice in a situation like this. In terms of filled with kind of fear and despair, your choice is between like giving into that or looking for something else. And I feel like you're just describing the something else. Like hold on, I thought I could have sworn at some point I believed in God, in this God person, and maybe that has some meaning for me in this situation.
Well, or at least, I mean, even if you want to translate more philosophically, I'm getting to a point where I'm accepting that I am not the maker of my own fate. This is something we in the West often have to relearn. You know, if you grow up in dire circumstances, you don't forget that. I'm not the maker of my own fate. I'm not cynical about it because that's just as useless, because I know I'm going to die as well. So what will I have lived for? And then the rest is faith. Every day we wake up, we go out, we go to work, we have to have faith that we come back, So our whole life is really structured around the sense of I'm going to do what I can, and I have to trust that on some level I'll get goodness returned from the universe for that. And on a larger level, we should live in the same way, that we say, God, I'm not going to bear the full weight, the full responsibility of this because it's too much to bear. It puts me into choices I'm not capable of making. So there is a level which I have to say, I want to address it somewhere, and why not, God?
Even on a small scale, it just makes me useless as well. Like if I if I spend so much time thinking about how what things should really be like, and I have no energy left to just do the little thing that someone needs some help with.
That's right.
And I think on that question of not being the maker of your own fate, if you want to see somebody who's realising that in public, kind of and being broadcast live as he does it, watch Trump's press conferences.
I've mentioned him again.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but I've been mesmerised. It's just played out there. There's this man-child standing there who it's all about praise for him and what people think of him, and he is faced with this implacable, immovable certainty of a virus that's running rampant in his country. And if nothing else good comes out of this, then he is wholly and utterly exposed, and I believe will continue to be so ever more across the next few weeks, which of course is a horrid thing to say, because the result of that is that more Americans are going to die than would have done otherwise. So I'm not saying that COVID was worth it just to see Trump squirm, but you really can see somebody facing the fact that there are things that no amount of money or whatever else he does to get his way is ever going to change. He's suddenly faced with it.
Yeah, there's a limit to self-centeredness, isn't there? And even on a smaller scale, if you were just to say, okay, I'm going to just wrap myself in here, I will try and avoid contact as much as possible, and I'm not going to help anybody because it's too risky. It's a very small existence. So, there's again, we're living in the same tension we were discussing earlier between, fatalism or saying we can bring the better world. And in a small scale, it's the same way of how selfish do you want to be in your existence, and how much do you really need others and helping others and trusting that there will be some good return for your actions.
So, what we're supposed to do at this point in our discussion is talk about like alternative visions of the world. So, what would be the right way for us to respond to the situation? And also, interesting question: what would a miracle look like? So, Leah, what would a miracle look like, or what would an alternative vision of the world be?
Well, there are all kind of good things that can come out of this. A reappraisal of what human flourishing actually looks like, a better way to measure economies and well-being that includes whether people are actually flourishing or not, and whether the planet is being looked after in a way that will continue to sustain us over the next millennia. There is always a chance that this becomes an opportunity for reflection and rethink, and similar to the way that the Second World War was a hideous and a horrible thing that nobody would ever choose to go through, and yet it led to the creation of a world order which, whilst of course not perfect, had some really good things about it in terms of the prosperity and the flourishing that it brought about. So, maybe that's the miracle, isn't it? If it brings a rethink.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. Can we also have a universal basic income?
Yeah, I mean, it's been an idea that's been thrown around, isn't it? Definitely.
Well, certainly, as somebody's mentioned in our chat, they found the magic money tree that was hidden for years, and all of a sudden it's there, right? But isn't it amazing?
I don't buy into that. That money is going to get, that money is going to cripple. It's going to get paid back.
But look, I mean, like the system that has been installed, that the government guarantees a certain amount of loan when there's a real hardship. I mean, that's a precedent in a way. I'm not sure that's going to be basic universal income, and but I was just thinking, like, isn't it amazing that we can be in this situation and imagine a miracle, right? We have the ability to somehow transcend whatever comes around us and imagine a future where we have taken away something from this that is beautiful, that is great. And Andy's waiting for the other shoe to drop. I can see it.
I'm just thinking, you're about to say the miracle's already happened.
Not really. No, I mean that's also interesting in the sort of signing up for the NHS volunteers. I think that's a great unexpected thing. All of a sudden, that 400,000 sign up within a day to drive groceries around, to look out for one another. I mean, that is a sign of hope that we're not.
Yeah.
We're not just as exposed. There is good happening, and we can hold on to this. But what I was going to say is that we're able to imagine this kind of miracle, and maybe it'll come about. Maybe we will have a different way of reckoning. We will have other ways of looking out for one another. We will be a lot more alert to the fragileness of our lives and make different choices. If that comes, will that have been a miracle that comes from God, or will it be some sort of learning process? Do we even know? But isn't that interesting?
It's God, though, hey? I mean, it all comes from God. I mean,
it all comes from God. Exactly. Yeah, that's what I think. But Jörg said it didn't.
Well, that's what I mean by the mustard seed. It's these things are working their way out. They're things that God's put in motion that then,
we're living in a world that is deeply imbued by the Spirit of God, where these good things can plausibly grow out of bad things. So that's great. That's a reason to celebrate. And yet we can't control this. This is something that comes toward us, but it also looks quite human-made at the same time, because we're learning something. So it's that same tension between being asked to do good and not having the hubris of controlling everything and bringing the world to a better liberal future, whatever, but expecting that there's something else that comes toward us. I mean, we've had the same theme before. That's the tension we're living in.
Maybe that's what being a Christian is, like genuinely believing that parable about the mustard seed won't just rot away.
Mm-hmm.
You do something, it might grow into something.
That's faith.
That's a bit doing focused though, but you know what I mean. Or maybe you don't. Yeah. But
well, it's also but it's also faith focused, because not every mustard seed grows into something. Christian faith is not about, okay, this didn't work, let me try something else. Like there's an element of faith to say, okay, I'm gonna try this again, and sometimes it doesn't work, and God, you know why. Like this is beyond me. This is above my pay grade. I'm not gonna have the answer to this one. You're just gonna point me to the behemoth as God does in Job, or you're gonna tell me some sort of fantastic story about the universe, and I don't know. and the acknowledgement of that is Christian as well, because in the end, this is also what Jesus does on the cross. He says, "This is going to be yours, God."
Yeah, the trust involved in letting yourself be killed in a way that will hopefully serve as a useful example for others later is quite extreme.
No,
that's what we think Jesus was doing.
I bet there's a number of doctors making that choice right now who know there's a pretty good chance. And why am I doing it? Because I believe there's good in humanity and there's a sense of duty, and I'm going to do it. And to me, that is a good expression of Christian justice, because there is that same trust that it's not going to be for naught.
Wow. I've been trying to think about what a miracle would look like in my own self, because I've kind of disappeared into, like, I have a tendency to want to hide, so being told by the government to hide leads me to only one thing. So, yeah. But yeah, so I've been wondering what a miracle in me would look like, and I think a sign of it would be like a sense of the transcendence of, my own death and my own life are fundamentally both things that are going to happen, and that's okay.
And there's a lot riding on the dash between that date of birth and date of death. There's a lot that happens there that is still going to have happened, that's not going to disappear, that goes into God's future.
Well, that brings us back to the mustard seed, yeah.
My miracle is still being stuck in the house with my kids and not killing them.
So Lizzie, our producer, is just asking us in the text chat: would a miracle be if everyone was miraculously cured?
Sure, of course. Is it going to happen? Don't know.
Why not? I mean, it's definitely not going to happen, is it?
Well, what do you mean by cured? Many people will come out of this healthy, but that's not. But why? Like we want miracles that are total, right? That will be sort of, that would be so encompassing that you have to ask yourself the question: what would that world even look like that you live in?
What would the next miracle have to be in order to be consistent? Yeah,
and in the end, do you end up with every little problem just wizard away? Is that really the world that we're aspiring to? Is that what we're looking for? It's certainly not the biblical world.
God's miracles always seem to have a purpose. Jesus talked about his miracles being signs, didn't he? So they were signs. They were meant to point to something, and I'm not quite sure what everybody suddenly being cured of COVID-19 would actually point to. What does it demonstrate? How would it help?
Why is God so callous that he only do good things if they've got some other purpose other than the good thing?
No, I mean, you're right. It easily gets very cynical. I mean, it's thinking about the kind of conversation we're having here, and my answer wouldn't come out as easily if I had a relative laying in the hospital right now, right? Yeah. Say, of course, this is what I want. And if you're listening to the podcast and somebody is ill or has been ill or, God forbid, has even died, then this whole conversation will be extremely painful, because we do expect something else to happen, and yet we know from experience it doesn't always. In fact, if you're honest, it often doesn't at all.
Well, it mostly doesn't, really.
Yeah.
I mean, we have in the Bible, I don't know, if you added up how many people got healed or saved in the Bible, it's a fractional proportion of the world's population. I just think, I suppose what I was trying to say about the sign thing is that, in general, God doesn't do miracles unless they are there to point to something. So if we're looking for things to be fixed by a miracle, then it doesn't, from my reading of the Bible, seem to be the way that God works, except for in very limited, very specific circumstances. And that is harsh and callous sounding, but that does seem to be the way he works.
And if he did, great. Like, there's nothing, nothing be worth in somebody sitting down on the sideline saying, this couldn't have, this was a miracle, but it couldn't have been God. It's not theologically plausible. And so, we can all celebrate this, but we need to bring this back to the two trees and the tree of knowing good and evil. All this discussion is about us saying, if I was God, this is how I'd do it. Or I think this is how God should do it. If I had this kind of power, I could put it to better use. And I don't know. I think that's such a... We're not in this place. And if COVID-19 has shown us anything, that even in a technological world, we're not in this place. I mean, who of us would have believed that we would shut down the entire world 2 or maybe 3 weeks ago? So, one thing we cannot accuse the Bible of is being unrealistic. It's very realistic about the world and our place therein and our ability to make sense of it. And again, for me, this brings it full circle back to the faith thing. There are things I have power over. I can decide what I do with this situation right now. And this is what I should be focusing on. And the rest needs to be, God, there's a future coming from you, and I will take whatever that is. And sometimes it's going to be really, really great. And I will celebrate it when it is. And sometimes it's going to be very, very tough. And I will still trust.
And I think I'm just thinking about Lord of the Rings, actually. I think that's a lot of what Tolkien was driving at. I know Andy hates Tolkien, but...
Do I?
Was it the
I find it.
Was it the Hobbit? The Hobbit
dull.
You didn't like. Oh, yeah, you find it dull. Sorry, hates is a bit strong. But
I'm okay with the points taken from it, so long as I don't have to read it.
That's fine. I won't make you read it. But you have this ring which is giving humanity, or hobbits, or whoever, ultimate power, and Tolkien's answer is very clearly that it needs to be destroyed. We can't handle that amount of power, and yeah.
Oh wow, that's a whole new perspective. Goodness me, it's quite hard to keep up with you.
Sorry, that just popped.
No, it's amazing.
Probably nonsense, but anyway. And instead, you have exactly what we've been talking about, which is a very dull. You are right, Andy, and I think a lot of Lord of the Rings is purposefully dull. Because you have these two poor, slightly useless hobbits trudging through miserable countryside, very often with nothing happening for pages and pages and pages, and they are fulfilling a very boring, very dull but necessary task. And they don't know all the great battles and heroic things that are going on in other parts of the story, and you keep getting brought back throughout the book. The very long book, you keep getting brought back to these two poor souls on a very, very boring journey. And then you cut away to like a great battle where somebody's a huge hero, and then you're back to people just doing what they have been asked to do faithfully and slowly and very dully until a slightly more exciting end to it.
Yes.
Just thinking about that miracle in myself, and thinking about people who are grieving, and if you're grieving now, then we're crying with you, and looking for that miracle in myself, and maybe even in you, is to somehow be crying, and also at times of joy being full of joy, and still knowing that this is all part of this beautiful thing that we're in, that we have some kind of faith
has some meaning in it. That's all I'd like. Just some understanding of that.
Mm-hmm.
So, Leah, you have a prayer. I think we probably should draw it together and you should read that to us, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure. It's from a book called Ruthless Trust by Brendan Manning. And it goes like this. Ruthless trust is an unerring sense, way deep down, that beneath the surface agitation, boredom, and insecurity of life, it's going to be all right. Ill winds may blow, more character defects may surface, sickness may visit, and friends will surely die. But a stubborn, irrefutable certainty persists that God is with us and loves us in our struggle to be faithful. A non-rational, absolutely true intuition pervades that there is something unfathomably big in the universe, something that points to someone who is filled with peace and power and love and undreamed of creativity, someone who inevitably will reconcile all things in themselves.
Thank you, Leah. Wow. So, listener, we hope that you're well, and we encourage you to care for the people around you and to care for yourself. And we'll see you next time.
You've been listening to Justice Warriors. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can also follow us on social media by searching for Justice Warriors, where warrior is spelt like someone who worries about things. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a rating, since that helps other people find us. Also, please tell your friends about us in real life. We'd love to hear from you. To get in touch, use the email address in the show notes or contact us via the social media links. Thanks for listening.
They told you, now you do what they told you.